The candle guttered again, and Penelope Vale stabbed her needle through the silk fabric with more force than necessary, squinting in the dim light that barely reached her cramped workroom above the general store. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a brilliant September day in 1872, and here she sat in near darkness, ruining her eyesight to finish Mrs. Harrison's wedding dress before Sunday. The afternoon sun blazed outside, but not a single ray penetrated the solid log walls of her rented room in Buffalo, Wyoming, a town that had sprung up along the stage route and now bustled with miners, ranchers, and families seeking their fortunes in the vast Wyoming territory. She set down her work and pressed her fingers against her burning eyes. 6 months of this, 6 months of working by candlelight and lamplight, because the man who built this room had seen fit to construct it like a cave. The general store below had windows, plenty of them, but her living quarters and workspace above had exactly none. When she had complained to Mr. Thornton, the store owner and her landlord, he had shrugged and said she was lucky to have a roof at all, being an unmarried woman alone in a territory town. Penelope was 22 years old, and she had come west from Ohio after her father died, leaving her with nothing but debts, and a skill with a needle that her mother had taught her before consumption took her when Penelope was 16. She had thought Wyoming would offer opportunities, and it had in a way. The women here were desperate for someone who could sew a straight seam, let alone create the elaborate dresses they desired. But the work was destroying her vision, and she knew it. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden stairs outside her door made her straighten. She was not expecting anyone, and unannounced visitors in a town like Buffalo could mean trouble. She reached for the small pistol she kept in her sewing basket, a necessity she had learned within her first week in Wyoming. The knock that came was solid but not threatening, 3 measured raps that spoke of patience rather than urgency. "Miss Vale, my name is Daniel Sawyer. Your landlord sent me up to discuss your window situation." Penelope frowned and moved to the door, keeping the pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. "I have no window situation to discuss. Mr. Thornton made it clear he would not be making any modifications." "No, madam, but I am not Mr. Thornton. May I come in? I promise I mean no harm. Mrs. Thornton is downstairs and can vouch for my character if you would like to fetch her first." His voice was deep and calm, with an accent that suggested he had been born somewhere in the mountains and raised by the wilderness itself. There was something in his tone that made Penelope believe him, but she was not a fool. She opened the door only a crack, keeping the chain latch engaged. The man on the other side was not what she expected. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, and his face was weathered by sun and wind in a way that spoke of years spent outdoors. His arms, visible beneath the rolled sleeves of his worn cotton shirt, were corded with muscle, and his hands looked like they could snap timber as easily as twigs. But his eyes, a startling blue-gray like storm clouds over the mountains, held a gentleness that contradicted his formidable appearance. "I apologize for the intrusion, Miss Vale. I was down at Thornton's buying supplies, and I overheard you speaking with Mrs. Thornton about your difficulty with the light. I am a carpenter of sorts, among other things, and I thought I might offer my services." "I cannot afford to hire a carpenter, Mr. Sawyer. I can barely afford the rent on this room as it is." He shook his head, and a small smile touched his lips. "I was not proposing to charge you, madam. I was proposing a trade. I have a sister up in the mountains, about 15 miles north of here. She is getting married come spring, and she needs a proper dress. I have the money to pay for it, but I thought perhaps we could arrange an exchange." I cut windows into your walls and fit them with proper glass, and you make my sister the finest wedding dress the Wyoming Territory has ever seen." Penelope studied him through the crack in the door. It was an unusual offer, and unusual offers in the West often came with strings attached. But there was something honest in his face, something that reminded her of her father before the drink took him. "Why would you do this? You do not know me." "No, madam, I do not. But I know what it is like to work in bad conditions. And I know that a woman with a skill like yours should not be going blind in a dark room when the solution is as simple as cutting a hole in a wall and fitting it with glass. Besides, my sister Mary deserves a beautiful dress. And from what Mrs. Thornton says, you are the only seamstress within 50 miles who could make one properly." Penelope considered this. The work would be significant, a full wedding dress with all the trimmings, but so would cutting windows. And the thought of working in natural light, of not having to squint and strain by candlelight, was almost too appealing to resist. "Very well, Mr. Sawyer. But I want to meet your sister first, take her measurements, and discuss what she wants before I agree to anything. And the work will be done properly, with a contract written and witnessed." His smile widened, transforming his rugged face into something surprisingly warm. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Vale. Would tomorrow suit you for a visit? I can come by with a wagon at first light and take you up to my place. I will have you back by evening." "First light is very early, Mr. Sawyer." "Yes, madam, but it is a long ride, and I want you to have plenty of time to visit with Mary and still get back before dark. The mountain roads are not safe at night, even with me along." Penelope nodded slowly. "Very well. First light tomorrow, but I will inform Mrs. Thornton of my plans, and if I do not return by dark, she will send the marshal after you." "That sounds entirely reasonable, Miss Vale. I will see you tomorrow morning." He touched the brim of his hat and turned to go, his boots heavy on the wooden stairs. Penelope closed the door and leaned against it, her heart beating faster than it should. There was something about Daniel Sawyer that unsettled her, though not in a frightening way. He was unlike any man she had met in Buffalo, most of whom looked at her with either suspicion or unwanted interest. He had looked at her like she was a person with a problem he could solve, nothing more and nothing less. She went back to her sewing, but her mind kept wandering to the possibility of windows, of natural light streaming into her cramped room, of being able to work without the constant headache that had become her companion. That night, she lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Buffalo settling down around her. A piano jangled from the saloon down the street, someone shouted something incomprehensible, and a dog barked in the distance. She thought about Daniel Sawyer and wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was sunlight pouring through windows that did not yet exist, and she decided that some risks were worth taking. The knock came just as the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the sky. Penelope was already dressed in her most practical traveling clothes, a simple brown dress with a sturdy wool shawl, and her hair pinned up securely under a bonnet. She had packed a small bag with her measuring tape, notebook, and pencils, as well as some samples of fabric and lace to show Mary Sawyer what was possible. Daniel Sawyer stood at her door looking exactly as he had the day before, except now he wore a heavy canvas coat against the morning chill. "Good morning, Miss Vale. I have the wagon waiting out front. Did you speak with Mrs. Thornton?" "I did. She knows where I am going and when to expect me back." "Good. Shall we go?" The wagon was sturdy and well-maintained, pulled by 2 strong horses that looked capable of handling mountain roads. Daniel helped her up onto the seat with a hand that was gentle despite its obvious strength. And then they were off, rolling through the quiet streets of Buffalo as the town began to wake around them. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Penelope watched the landscape change as they left the town behind, the rolling grasslands gradually giving way to foothills covered in pine and aspen. The air grew cooler and cleaner, and she found herself breathing deeply, realizing how much she had missed the freshness of open country after months in the dusty, smoke-filled town. "You are from back east," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. It was not a question. "Ohio. A small town outside Cleveland. And you are from the mountains. Born in Colorado, raised in these Wyoming ranges. My father was a trapper, taught me everything about living in the high country. He passed 5 years ago, and I have been on my own since then, except for Mary. Your sister is younger than you, by 8 years. She is 20 now, and her fiancé is a good man, a rancher named Thomas Blake who has property on the other side of the mountain. They have been courting for 2 years, and it is about time they got married. I have been looking after Mary since our father died, but she deserves her own life now." There was affection in his voice when he spoke of his sister, and something else too, a kind of wistfulness that Penelope recognized. It was the sound of someone who had been alone for a long time and had made peace with it, but who still felt the weight of that solitude. "It must be difficult, living so far from town," she said. "It has its challenges, but it suits me. I am not much for crowds, and the mountains provide everything I need. I trap in the winter, do carpentry and odd jobs for the ranchers and miners in the summer, and keep to myself the rest of the time. It is a good life, if a lonely one." The honesty of his answer surprised her. Men in her experience rarely admitted to loneliness, as if it were a weakness rather than a simple fact of their circumstances. "I understand something of loneliness myself," she said quietly. "Buffalo is full of people, but I know very few of them and fewer still who I would call friends. Most see me as the spinster seamstress, odd for being unmarried and alone. Some think I am too proud, others think there must be something wrong with me. The truth is simply that I have not met anyone worth marrying, and I will not tie myself to a man just to avoid being alone." Daniel glanced at her, and she saw approval in his eyes. "That is wise. Too many people marry for the wrong reasons out here, and it leads to misery for everyone involved. Better to be alone and content than married and wretched." They talked more as the wagon climbed higher into the mountains, the conversation flowing more easily than Penelope would have expected. Daniel told her about the wildlife he encountered, the challenges of mountain winters, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. She told him about her work, the particular challenges of creating a dress that would fit properly and last, the pleasure of seeing a woman's face light up when she saw herself transformed by beautiful clothing. By the time they reached Daniel's property, the sun was high overhead, and Penelope was surprised to realize she had been enjoying herself. The ride had not felt like 3 hours at all. Daniel's home was not what she expected. Instead of a rough cabin, she saw a solid log house with a stone chimney, set in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. There were outbuildings as well, a barn and what looked like a workshop, all built with the same careful attention to detail. A stream ran nearby, its water clear and cold from the mountain snows, and the whole scene had an air of permanence and care that spoke volumes about the man who lived here. "Daniel," a young woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She had the same dark hair as her brother, but her eyes were green, and her face was open and friendly. "You are back early, and this must be Miss Vale. Mary, this is Penelope Vale, the seamstress from Buffalo. Miss Vale, my sister Mary." Penelope climbed down from the wagon, accepting Daniel's offered hand, and found herself immediately embraced by Mary Sawyer, who hugged her like an old friend. "I am so happy to meet you. Daniel told me about your arrangement, and I could hardly sleep last night for excitement. I never thought I would have a real wedding dress, made by a real seamstress. Come inside, please. I have coffee ready and some bread fresh from the oven." The interior of the house was as well maintained as the exterior, with polished wood floors, simple but sturdy furniture, and windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. Penelope felt a pang of envy at those windows, at the luxury of all that natural light. Over coffee and bread, they discussed the wedding dress. Mary had clear ideas about what she wanted, simple elegance rather than fussy elaboration, something that would be beautiful but practical enough to wear again for special occasions. She showed Penelope a drawing she had made, surprisingly skilled, of a dress with a fitted bodice and a full skirt, with simple lace trim at the collar and cuffs. "This is lovely," Penelope said, studying the drawing. "Very achievable, and it will suit you beautifully. Let me take your measurements, and then we can discuss fabric. I have access to some beautiful materials through Mr. Thornton's store, and I can order anything special if needed." They spent the next hour measuring and discussing details, and Penelope found herself genuinely liking Mary Sawyer. The young woman was intelligent and practical, with none of the affected airs that some of Penelope's clients put on. She was also clearly devoted to her brother, speaking of him with affection and respect. "Daniel has been both mother and father to me since our pa died," Mary said as they finished up. "He taught me to read and write, to keep house, to shoot and ride and take care of myself. He could have left me with relatives back east, but he kept me here and made sure I had everything I needed. Thomas knows how lucky he is to be marrying me, because if Daniel did not approve of him, there would be no wedding." "Your brother seems like a good man," Penelope said carefully. "He is the best man I know," Mary said firmly, "but he is also stubborn and too content with his own company. He needs someone to shake up his solitary life, someone who can match his strength with her own. He needs a woman who is not afraid of hard work or isolation, someone who chose independence rather than having it forced upon her." Penelope felt her cheeks warm at the obvious implication. "Mary, I just met your brother yesterday." "I know, but I also know my brother. He does not offer to help people unless he is genuinely moved to do so. The fact that he sought you out, that he proposed this arrangement, tells me he saw something in you worth knowing. And from the way he looked at you when you arrived, I would say my instincts are correct." Before Penelope could respond, Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Mary, stop matchmaking and let Miss Vale breathe. I am sure she has heard quite enough of your romantic notions for one day." Mary laughed, not at all embarrassed. "Fine, I will behave. But Miss Vale, you must stay for lunch, I insist. And Daniel can show you his workshop afterward. You should see what he is capable of building before you agree to let him cut into your walls." Lunch was simple but delicious. Venison stew with vegetables from Mary's garden and more of the excellent bread. The conversation flowed easily, and Penelope found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did with new people. There was something about the Sawyer siblings that felt safe, genuine in a way that was rare in her experience. After lunch, Daniel led her to his workshop, a spacious building filled with tools, lumber, and the sharp, pleasant smell of fresh-cut wood. He showed her pieces he had made, furniture and window frames, and even some decorative carvings that demonstrated real artistry. "This is beautiful work," Penelope said, running her hand over a rocking chair with curved arms that flowed like water. "You have real talent, Mr. Sawyer." "Daniel, please. If we are going to be working together, we should use first names. And thank you." My father taught me to respect wood, to work with its nature rather than against it. I find it satisfying making things that will last, that will serve a purpose and bring comfort. I feel the same way about sewing, Penelope said. There is something deeply satisfying about creating something both beautiful and useful. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and Penelope became acutely aware of how close Daniel was standing, of the warmth radiating from his large frame, of the way his presence seemed to fill the space around him without being overwhelming. "I want to thank you," she said quietly, "for offering to do this. I know you said it was a trade, but the truth is, the work you will be doing is worth far more than a wedding dress. You are being generous, and I appreciate it." Daniel turned to look at her, and his storm cloud eyes were intense. "I am not being generous, Penelope. I am being selfish. I want my sister to have the dress she deserves, and I want to help someone who needs it. But more than that, I want a reason to spend time in Buffalo, to come to town more often than I usually do. And if that reason happens to be checking on the progress of the windows I am installing, well, that seems like a good enough excuse." Penelope's breath caught in her throat. She had been admired before, pursued even, but never with such straightforward honesty. There was no game playing in Daniel Sawyer, no false flattery or manipulation. He simply said what he meant and let her decide what to do with it. "I see," she said, and was proud that her voice remained steady. "Then we should draw up that contract and make this arrangement official." Daniel smiled, and she felt her heart skip. "We should indeed." They spent another hour working out the details, writing up a simple contract that specified the work to be done on both sides. Daniel would install 2 large windows in Penelope's room, providing proper light for her work. She would create a wedding dress for Mary, complete with all accessories, to be finished by the end of March, giving her 6 months to complete the work. They both signed, and Mary witnessed the document with a smile that suggested she saw this as the beginning of something much more significant than a simple business arrangement. The ride back to Buffalo that evening was different from the morning journey. The conversation was more personal, less guarded. Daniel told her about growing up in the mountains, about learning to track and hunt, about the harsh beauty of winter in the high country. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her mother's patient teaching, about the grief of losing both parents and finding herself alone in the world. "You are very brave," Daniel said as they descended back into the grasslands, Buffalo visible in the distance. "Coming out here alone, making a life for yourself, that takes courage." "Or desperation," Penelope said with a wry smile. "I did not have many choices. It was come west and try to make something of myself, or stay in Ohio and marry the first man who would have me, regardless of whether he was decent or not. Then I am glad you chose bravery over desperation. Wyoming is better for having you here." They reached Buffalo just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Daniel helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I will come by in 2 days to start work on the windows," he said. "It should take me about a week to complete everything, maybe less if the weather holds. Will that suit you? That will be perfect. And thank you, Daniel, for everything." "The thanks should go both ways. I will see you in 2 days, Penelope." She watched him drive away, then turned to find Mrs. Thornton standing in the doorway of the general store, a knowing look on her face. "That Daniel Sawyer is a good man," Mrs. Thornton said. "Keeps to himself mostly, but everyone who knows him speaks well of him. You could do worse, my dear." "Mrs. Thornton, it is a business arrangement, nothing more." "Of course it is, dear. Of course it is." But as Penelope climbed the stairs to her dark room and lit her candles to finish Mrs. Harrison's dress, She could not stop thinking about storm cloud eyes and gentle hands, about a man who built beautiful things and was not afraid to admit to loneliness. She worked late into the night, but for once, the candlelight did not seem quite so oppressive, because she knew it was temporary. Soon, very soon, she would have windows and daylight and perhaps, just perhaps, something else she had not even known she was hoping for. True to his word, Daniel arrived 2 days later with a wagon full of lumber, glass panes carefully wrapped in canvas, and a box of tools that looked well used and well maintained. He spent the first hour studying the walls of her room, measuring and making notes, before turning to her with a question. "Where would you like them?" "I am thinking 2 windows, one on the south wall to catch the morning light, and one on the west wall for the afternoon. That way, you will have good natural light from sunrise until a few hours before sunset." Penelope considered this, looking at her workspace and thinking about how the light would fall. "That sounds perfect. The south window should be near my sewing table, and the west window could be by the cutting table where I lay out patterns." Exactly what I was thinking. "Now, this is going to be messy and noisy, and you will not be able to stay in this room while I work. Do you have somewhere else you can go during the day? Mrs. Thornton said I could use a corner of the store below to work. It will not be ideal, but it will suffice for a week." Daniel nodded and began to work. Penelope gathered up her most urgent projects and carried them downstairs, but she found herself unable to focus on sewing. The sound of sawing and hammering from above was too distracting, or perhaps it was the knowledge of who was making those sounds and why. Mrs. Thornton noticed her distraction and smiled. "Why do not you take him up some lunch? He will be working through the noon hour otherwise, and no man works well on an empty stomach." So Penelope found herself climbing the stairs at midday with a basket of bread, cheese, and cold chicken, plus a jug of fresh water. She knocked on her own door, which felt strange, and Daniel opened it, his shirt damp with sweat and sawdust coating his hair and shoulders. "I brought lunch," she said, trying not to stare at the way his shirt clung to his muscled chest and arms. "That is very kind. Come in, see the progress." He had already cut the opening for the south window, and light was streaming into the room in a golden flood that made Penelope's breath catch. It was like seeing her cramped space for the first time, really seeing it, and the transformation was already dramatic. "Daniel, it is beautiful. I had no idea how much difference it would make. Wait until I get the glass fitted and sealed and then cut the second window. You will feel like you are in a completely different room." They ate lunch together, sitting on crates near the new window opening, and talked about everything and nothing. Daniel told her funny stories about mishaps with clients, about a rancher who had insisted on a window in his barn that was too large for the wall and nearly brought the whole structure down. She told him about difficult customers, about women who changed their minds 5 times about trim and then complained the dress was not what they wanted. "You have patience," Daniel observed. "I would have thrown someone out by now. Patience is necessary in my profession. And honestly, I enjoy the challenge of figuring out what people really want, even when they cannot articulate it themselves. It is like solving a puzzle. I suppose carpentry is the same way. People tell you what they want, but you have to understand what they need, and sometimes those are not the same thing." After lunch, Daniel went back to work, and Penelope reluctantly returned to the general store. But the knowledge of that sunlight-filled opening above her head made everything seem brighter, more hopeful. For the next week, Daniel worked from dawn until dusk, and Penelope found herself inventing reasons to check on his progress. She brought him water, lunch, coffee in the afternoon. They talked during his brief breaks, conversations that ranged from practical to philosophical, and she learned more about him with each passing day. He had been married once, briefly, when he was 21. His wife had not been able to handle the isolation of mountain life and had left him after less than a year, going back east to her family. The experience had made him wary of romantic entanglements, convinced that no woman would truly be happy with his way of life. "I cannot be someone I am not," he told her on the fourth day, as they sat in her transformed room with both windows now installed, the glass catching the afternoon light and throwing rainbows across the floor. "I tried, for her sake, to be more sociable, to spend more time in town, to pretend I enjoyed crowds and noise. But it made me miserable, and eventually it made her miserable too, because she could see I was not happy. When she left, I decided it was better to be alone than to try to force myself into a shape that does not fit." "That is not unreasonable," Penelope said quietly. "We should not have to change who we are fundamentally to be loved. The right person will love us as we are." "You believe that?" "That there is a right person for everyone. I want to believe it. But I have also learned to be content alone, to build a life that is meaningful and satisfying without depending on someone else to make it so. If the right person comes along, that would be wonderful. But I will not settle for the wrong person just to avoid being alone." Daniel looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are a remarkable woman, Penelope Vale. I am a practical woman who has learned hard lessons about independence and self-reliance." "There is nothing remarkable about that." "I disagree, but I will not argue with you." On the seventh day, Daniel finished the last details, sealing the windows properly to keep out drafts and testing the mechanisms to make sure they opened and closed smoothly. The transformation of the room was complete, and it was even better than Penelope had imagined. Light poured in from morning until evening, illuminating every corner, making the space feel twice as large and infinitely more welcoming. "It is perfect," she breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Daniel, thank you. This is going to change everything for me." "Good. That was the intention." He packed up his tools, moving with the efficient economy of motion that characterized everything he did. "Now you owe me a wedding dress, though I think I got the better end of this bargain." "Nonsense. Your work is easily worth twice what I am charging for Mary's dress." "Perhaps, but I cannot put a price on the look on your face right now. That is worth more than gold to me." Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past week, their conversations had grown increasingly personal, the attraction between them harder to deny or ignore. She knew she was falling for Daniel Sawyer, for his quiet strength and gentle humor, for the way he listened when she spoke and remembered small details she mentioned in passing. But she also knew he would be leaving soon, going back to his mountain solitude, and she was not sure what that meant for whatever was developing between them. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked impulsively. "It is the least I can do after you have worked so hard all week." "There is a decent restaurant in town, nothing fancy, but the food is good." Daniel hesitated, and she could see him wrestling with something internal. Finally, he nodded. "I would like that very much." They went to the restaurant on the main street, a simple establishment run by a German couple who served hearty food at reasonable prices. Daniel seemed uncomfortable at first, drawing stares from other diners who were not used to seeing the reclusive mountain man in town after dark. But he relaxed as they talked, and by the time their meals arrived, he was smiling and looking more at ease. "I do not do this often," he admitted. "Come to town for social reasons. I am usually in and out as quickly as possible, getting supplies and leaving before I have to interact with too many people." "Why? Is it that you dislike people or that you dislike crowds?" "Crowds, mostly. Too much noise, too many expectations. In the mountains, everything is straightforward. You work, you survive, you take care of what needs taking care of. In town, there are all these unspoken rules and social niceties that I never quite mastered. I always feel like I am doing something wrong, saying the wrong thing. You have not said anything wrong tonight. In fact, you have been perfectly charming, he laughed, a sound she was growing to love. Charming. I do not think anyone has ever called me that before. Then they were not paying attention. After dinner, they walked slowly back toward the general store, neither seeming eager for the evening to end. The night was cool but not cold, and the stars overhead were brilliant in the clear Wyoming sky. I will be going back to the mountains tomorrow, Daniel said as they reached her door. But I will be coming back to town once a month or so to check on supplies and see how Mary's dress is progressing. If that is acceptable to you. More than acceptable. I will want to have a fitting with Mary anyway, to make sure everything is coming along properly. Perhaps you could bring her to town for a visit in a few weeks. I can do that. He stood there, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart race. Penelope, I want to be honest with you about something. Please do. When I offered to build you these windows, I told myself it was just a practical arrangement, a fair trade. But that was not entirely true. From the moment Mrs. Thornton mentioned you, mentioned a seamstress working by candlelight in a dark room, I wanted to help. And when I met you, when I saw your independence and strength, your refusal to settle for less than you deserve, I knew I wanted to know you better. These past weeks have only confirmed what I suspected from the start. And what is that? That you are someone worth knowing. Someone worth taking risks for. Someone I would very much like to see again, and not just for business purposes. Penelope's breath caught. She had known this was coming, had felt the pull between them growing stronger each day, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. I would like that too, she said quietly. But Daniel, I need you to understand something. I cannot leave Buffalo right now. My business is here, my clients, my livelihood, and I do not know if I am suited for mountain life. I have never lived in such isolation. I know, and I am not asking you to make any decisions or promises. I am just asking if I can court you properly, come to town to see you, let whatever is between us develop naturally without rushing or forcing it. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I would like that very much. He smiled then, that transformative smile that lit up his whole face, and bent down to kiss her cheek gently. Then I will see you in 3 weeks, Penelope Vale. Try not to work too hard by your new windows. I will do my best. Travel safely, Daniel Sawyer. She watched him walk away into the darkness, then climbed the stairs to her room, her transformed, light-filled room, and sat by the west window looking out at the stars. Everything had changed in just 1 week, and she had the feeling her life would never be the same again. The next 3 weeks passed both quickly and slowly. Penelope threw herself into work, starting Mary's wedding dress with care and attention to every detail. The quality of her work improved dramatically now that she could see properly, and her other clients noticed the difference. Word spread that the seamstress above Thornton's general store was producing exceptional work, and Penelope found herself with more commissions than she could easily handle. But no matter how busy she was, she thought about Daniel constantly. She replayed their conversations in her mind, remembered the way he looked at her, the gentleness in his strong hands, the patient intelligence in his storm cloud eyes. She had been courted before, but never like this, never with such straightforward honesty and respect for her independence. Mrs. Thornton noticed her distraction and teased her gently about it. You are glowing, my dear. I have never seen you look so happy. I am not glowing. I am simply pleased with my new windows. Of course, the windows. That is definitely what has you smiling to yourself while you sew." When Daniel finally appeared 3 weeks later, Penelope had to restrain herself from running down the stairs to greet him. Instead, she finished the seam she was working on, set it aside carefully, and descended at a measured pace. But her heart was pounding, and she knew her face was flushed with pleasure. He was standing in the general store, talking with Mr. Thornton about lumber prices, and he turned when she entered. The smile that crossed his face told her everything she needed to know about how he felt seeing her again. "Miss Vale," he said formally, though his eyes were warm. "Mr. Sawyer. I was not expecting you until next week. I finished my work early and thought I would check on how the dress is progressing. Mary is anxious to see it. It is coming along beautifully. I have the bodice nearly finished and the skirt cut and pinned. Would you like to come up and see?" They climbed the stairs together, and Penelope was acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the way his bulk seemed to make the stairwell feel smaller. In her room, she showed him the dress laid out on her work table, the cream-colored silk glowing in the afternoon light that streamed through the windows he had built. "It is beautiful," he said quietly. "Mary will love it. I hope so. I am trying to capture what she described, simple elegance. Nothing too fussy or elaborate, but still special enough for a wedding. You have succeeded." He moved to the window, looking out at the view of Buffalo's Main Street. "How are the windows working out? Any problems with drafts or leaks?" "None at all. They are perfect, Daniel. I cannot thank you enough for what you have done. My eyesight has already improved and my work is better than it has ever been." He turned back to her, and suddenly the room felt very small. "I am glad, but I confess, checking on the windows was not my only reason for coming to town early. No, I wanted to see you. I have been thinking about you constantly these past 3 weeks, wondering how you were, what you were doing, if you had been thinking about me at all." "I have," she admitted. "More than I probably should. Why should not you? We agreed I could court you." "Thinking about each other seems like a reasonable part of courtship." Penelope laughed, the tension breaking. "I suppose you are right. Would you like to have dinner with me again tonight? We could go back to the German restaurant." "I would like that very much. But Penelope, I have a better idea. Tomorrow is Sunday, and Mary asked if you would like to come up to the house for dinner. She wants to see the dress progress, and she also wants to know you better. Would you be willing to make the trip?" "I would love to. What time should I be ready?" "I will come by at first light again. We can spend the day at the house, have dinner, and I will bring you back before dark. And this time, Mary has promised not to embarrass me with her matchmaking." "I liked her matchmaking. She was very enthusiastic about your virtues. That is what embarrasses me. She makes me sound much better than I am." "I doubt that is possible." They had dinner again that night, and this time Daniel seemed more comfortable, less conscious of the other diners and more focused on their conversation. They talked about books they had read, places they had been, dreams they had for the future. Penelope learned that Daniel wanted to expand his carpentry business, to take on larger projects and build structures that would last for generations. She told him about her hope of someday having her own shop, a real dressmaking establishment instead of just a rented room above a general store. "You could do it," Daniel said firmly. "You have the skill and the business sense. All you need is the capital to start. Capital is the problem. I am saving what I can, but it will be years before I have enough. Maybe not as long as you think. Good work gets noticed, and from what I have seen, your work is exceptional." Walking back through the dark streets afterward, Daniel took her hand, and Penelope felt a thrill run through her at the simple contact. His hand was large and calloused from work, but his grip was gentle, and she felt safe in a way she rarely did walking through Buffalo after dark. At her door, he kissed her again, but this time on the lips, a soft, careful kiss that still managed to make her knees weak and her head spin. When he pulled back, his eyes were searching hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I know it is too soon to say it, and I do not want to scare you away, but I believe in honesty, and that is the honest truth." Penelope reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble under her fingers. "It is not too soon, because I am falling in love with you too. I did not expect this, did not plan for it, but here we are." "Here we are," he echoed and kissed her again, deeper this time, with more passion but still with that careful restraint that showed his respect for her. The next day, the trip up to the mountain house felt different. They held hands as the wagon rolled along, and their conversation was interspersed with comfortable silences that felt natural rather than awkward. Penelope found herself noticing details about the landscape she had missed on her first trip. The particular way the light filtered through the pine trees, the sound of the stream running clear and cold over smooth stones, the calls of birds she could not identify. Mary greeted them with obvious delight, hugging Penelope like a sister and giving her brother a knowing look that made him shake his head ruefully. I know, you were right. You do not have to say it." "I would never say I told you so," Mary said innocently. "But I absolutely did tell you so." The day was wonderful. Penelope showed Mary the progress on the dress, and they did a preliminary fitting that went perfectly. Mary was delighted with how it was coming together, turning in front of the mirror Daniel had propped against the wall and imagining herself wearing it on her wedding day. "Thomas will not know what hit him," she said happily. "Miss Vale, you are an artist. Please call me Penelope. If I am going to be spending time with your brother, we should be on first-name terms." "I was hoping you would say that, and I hope you will be spending lots of time with Daniel. He has been alone too long, and he deserves someone wonderful. And you deserve someone who will appreciate your strength and independence instead of being threatened by it." After the fitting, Daniel took Penelope on a tour of his property. He showed her the stream where he caught trout, the meadow where deer came to graze in the early morning, the view from the ridge above the house that stretched for miles across the Wyoming wilderness. Standing there, with the wind in her hair and Daniel's arm around her waist, Penelope felt something shift inside her. The isolation that had seemed daunting before now felt peaceful, and she began to understand why Daniel loved this life so much. "I can see why you do not want to leave this," she said quietly. "It is home, the only real home I have ever known. But Penelope, I want you to understand something. If we continue down this path, if this develops into something permanent, I am not going to ask you to give up your work or your independence. We will find a way to make it work that satisfies both of us. Maybe I spend more time in town, or maybe we find a way for you to work up here part of the time. I do not have all the answers, but I know I do not want you to sacrifice who you are for me. And I do not want you to sacrifice who you are for me either. But I think you are right, that if we want it badly enough, we can find a way to make it work." He turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "Do you want it badly enough, Penelope? Because I need to know. I am already in too deep to protect my heart if this is not going somewhere real." She looked up at him, at this strong, gentle man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, and knew her answer with absolute certainty. "Yes, I want it badly enough. I want you, Daniel Sawyer, and I want a life with you, whatever that looks like." He kissed her then, thoroughly and passionately, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all her newfound certainty into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Penelope Vale." I think I have loved you since I first saw you standing in that dark room, determined to make something of yourself despite the obstacles. I love you too. And I think we are going to build something beautiful together, just like you built those windows with care and patience and skill. Dinner with Mary that evening was filled with laughter and joy. The three of them sat around the solid table Daniel had built, eating venison roast and vegetables, and planning a future that now seemed bright and full of possibility. Mary was thrilled that her matchmaking had succeeded, and she insisted they set a date for her to come to town again for another dress fitting. And maybe by then you two will have figured out the details of your own wedding, she said with a mischievous smile. Mary, you are getting ahead of yourself, Daniel protested. Am I? You just told her you loved her today. How long do you think a man like you is going to wait once you have made up your mind? Penelope laughed at Daniel's embarrassed expression. She has a point. You are not exactly the type to drag your feet once you have decided on something. Maybe not, but I also want to do this properly. Give Penelope time to be sure to understand what she would be getting into. I think I have a pretty good idea, Penelope said, reaching across the table to take his hand. But I agree we should not rush. Let us get through Mary's wedding first, and then we can think about our own future. On the ride back to Buffalo that evening, they talked seriously about practicalities. Daniel suggested that once they were married, they could split their time between the mountain house and a place in town, perhaps renting a small house where Penelope could have a proper shop and still maintain her business. He could do his carpentry work both in the mountains and in town, taking commissions that allowed for flexibility. I have been thinking about this a lot, he admitted, trying to figure out how to make it work before I even told you how I felt. I know it will not always be easy, but I think we can do it if we are both willing to compromise. I am willing, Penelope said firmly. I love my work, but I love you more. We will find a way. Over the next few months, they did exactly that. Daniel came to town every week, sometimes staying for a few days to work on projects for various clients in Buffalo. He courted Penelope properly, taking her to dinners, on walks along the creek that ran through town, to church services on Sunday mornings. The townspeople grew accustomed to seeing the reclusive mountain man on Main Street, and more than a few remarked on the transformation in both Daniel and Penelope, how they glowed when they were together. Penelope worked steadily on Mary's wedding dress, and on a cold November day, Daniel and Mary came to town for the final fitting. The dress was perfect, fitting Mary like it had been made for her, which of course it had. Mary cried when she saw herself in the mirror, and even Daniel's eyes looked suspiciously bright. Penelope, it is more than I ever dreamed of, Mary said, hugging her tightly. Thank you so much. You are very welcome. You are going to be a beautiful bride. After Mary changed back into her regular clothes, Daniel stayed behind while his sister went to browse the general store. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, carved with delicate flowers. I made this, he said, opening it to reveal a ring. It was simple gold with a small diamond, nothing elaborate, but the box it came in was a work of art. Penelope Vale, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on building a life with a mountain man who loves you more than he ever thought he could love anyone? Penelope's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. Yes. Yes, Daniel, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, just like everything else he made. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her while the afternoon light streamed through the windows he had built, the windows that had changed everything. They were married in Buffalo on a crisp February day in 1873, with Mary as Penelope's bridesmaid and Thomas Blake as Daniel's best man. Penelope wore a dress she had made herself, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simpler than Mary's wedding dress, but no less beautiful. The ceremony was held in the small church on the edge of town, and afterward they had a celebration at the restaurant where they had shared their first dinner together. As a wedding present, Mr. Thornton offered to sell Penelope the building that housed the general store and her old room above it at a very reasonable price. With the money Daniel had saved from his carpentry work and what Penelope had put away, they were able to buy it outright. They converted the upstairs into a proper dressmaking shop with plenty of windows, and Penelope hired 2 young women from town to help her with the increasing volume of work. Daniel built them a small but comfortable house on the outskirts of Buffalo, within sight of the mountains he loved, but close enough to town that Penelope could walk to her shop in 15 minutes. It had large windows in every room and a workshop behind it where Daniel could work on his carpentry projects. They split their time between the townhouse and the mountain property, spending summers and early falls in the high country and winters and springs in Buffalo. It was not always easy, balancing their different needs and work requirements, but they made it function through constant communication and genuine respect for each other's needs and dreams. Mary married Thomas Blake in late March, wearing her beautiful dress and crying happy tears throughout the ceremony. She and Thomas settled on his ranch, and within a year, they had a baby boy they named Daniel after the uncle who had raised Mary with such love and care. Penelope and Daniel's first child, a son they named Peter, was born in the mountain house on a summer morning in 1874, delivered by Mary, who had learned midwifery from an older ranch woman. Daniel held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overcome by the reality of this tiny life he had helped create. "He is perfect," he whispered, looking at Penelope with such love and awe that she felt her heart might burst. "You are perfect. I cannot believe how lucky I am." "We are lucky," Penelope corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "All 3 of us." 2 years later, a daughter named Patricia was born in the townhouse during a spring snowstorm, loud and demanding from her first breath. She had her father's storm-cloud eyes and her mother's determination, and she kept both parents on their toes from the beginning. As the years passed, Penelope's dressmaking shop became the finest in the Wyoming Territory, known for quality and artistry that matched anything coming from back east. Women traveled from miles around to have dresses made by Penelope Sawyer, and she trained several young seamstresses who went on to open their own shops in other towns. Daniel's reputation as a carpenter and builder grew as well. He took on larger projects, designing and building homes and businesses throughout the territory, always with his signature attention to detail and craftsmanship. But he never lost his love for the mountains, and he made sure his family spent at least part of every year in the high country, teaching his children to fish and track and appreciate the wild beauty of Wyoming. On their 10th anniversary, Daniel surprised Penelope by expanding their mountain house, adding a large sunroom with windows on 3 sides where she could sew in the summers with spectacular views of the wilderness around them. He presented it to her on a warm June morning, and she walked through it with tears in her eyes, remembering that dark room above the general store where she had worked by candlelight so many years before. "You changed my life," she told him, standing in the flood of sunlight. "You gave me light when I was working in darkness, and you gave me love when I had stopped looking for it." "You changed my life too," Daniel said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. "You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a family, a purpose beyond simple survival. You made me believe that compromise does not mean losing yourself, that 2 independent people can build something together that is stronger than either of them alone." They stood there for a long time, looking out at the mountains and the life they had built together, a life that honored both of their needs and dreams. Their children's laughter echoed from somewhere outside, and Penelope felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. Years continued to pass in a blur of work and family, of summers in the mountains and winters in town, of children growing and businesses thriving. Peter grew into a thoughtful young man who inherited his father's skill with wood and his mother's artistic eye. Patricia became a fiery young woman who learned dressmaking from her mother, but also learned to shoot and ride from her father, comfortable in both the drawing room and the wilderness. When Mary's husband Thomas died suddenly of a heart problem in 1885, Daniel and Penelope brought her and her 3 children to stay with them for a year while she grieved and figured out her future. Eventually, Mary decided to stay in Buffalo, taking over a boarding house in town and running it with the practical competence she had learned from her brother. She never remarried, saying once had been enough, but she found contentment in her work and her children, and in being close to the brother who had always been her rock. Daniel and Penelope celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1893, surrounded by family and friends in the town they had helped build. Buffalo had grown from a rough stage stop into a proper town with schools and churches, shops and businesses, and the Sawyers were recognized as pillars of the community. But they never forgot where they had come from: the struggling seamstress in a dark room and the lonely mountain man who had found a way to bring light into her life. On a fall evening in 1895, Daniel and Penelope sat together in the sunroom of their mountain house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Their children were grown now, Peter married and working as a builder in Sheridan, Patricia engaged to a young doctor and planning a wedding for the following spring. The house was quiet in a way it had not been in years, and they were alone together as they had not been since the early days of their marriage. "Do you ever regret it?" Penelope asked, her head resting on Daniel's shoulder. "Giving up your solitude, taking on a family and all the complications that came with it." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously as he always did. "No," he said finally. "Not for a single moment. You gave me something I did not even know I needed, Penelope. You gave me a reason to build things that would last beyond my own lifetime, a legacy in our children and the community we helped create. The solitude was peaceful, but it was also empty. You filled that emptiness with light and love and purpose." "You did the same for me," Penelope said softly. "I thought independence meant being alone, proving I did not need anyone. But you taught me that true independence is choosing who you let into your life, building partnerships based on mutual respect and love rather than need or desperation. You gave me windows to work by daylight, but more than that, you gave me a life illuminated by love." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the mountains, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. After more than 2 decades together, words were often unnecessary. They understood each other in the deep, fundamental way that comes only from years of partnership, of working through challenges and celebrating triumphs, of building a life together one day at a time. Patricia's wedding in the spring of 1896 was a grand affair held in the Buffalo church, where her parents had married 23 years earlier. Penelope made her daughter's dress, a creation of white silk and French lace that took 3 months to complete. As she worked on it, sitting in her shop with sunlight streaming through the windows, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the mountain man who had seen a problem and fixed it, who had seen her and loved her. Daniel walked Patricia down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and afterward at the reception, he danced with both his daughter and his wife. his face showing the contentment of a man who had found everything he never knew he wanted. Peter and his wife gave Daniel and Penelope their first grandchild later that year, a baby girl named Mary after her great-aunt. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, Daniel looked at Penelope with wonder in his eyes. "We did this," he said quietly. "We built this family, this life. And it is more than I ever imagined possible." "We did it together," Penelope corrected, "with patience and compromise and love, just like you built those windows with care and skill and attention to detail." As they moved into their later years, Daniel and Penelope continued their pattern of splitting time between town and mountains. Though they spent more time in Buffalo, as their responsibilities to family and business kept them closer to town. Daniel taught carpentry to young men in Buffalo, passing on his skills and his philosophy of working with materials rather than against them. Penelope trained a new generation of seamstresses, and her shop remained the finest in the territory. They were blessed with more grandchildren as the years passed, a growing family that gathered for holidays and celebrations, filling their homes with noise and laughter and life. Daniel built toys for the grandchildren, intricate wooden animals and dolls that became treasured possessions. Penelope made clothes for them, tiny dresses and shirts that showed the same attention to detail as her finest adult creations. On their 30th anniversary in 1903, their children threw them a party that brought together everyone whose lives they had touched over the decades. The testimonials spoke of Daniel's integrity and skill, of buildings that still stood strong after 30 years, of furniture passed down through families. They spoke of Penelope's artistry and business acumen, of the women she had trained who had gone on to successful careers of their own, of the beautiful clothes that had marked the important moments in people's lives. But the speech that meant the most came from Mary, now in her 50s, and still running her boarding house with quiet competence. She stood before the assembled crowd and spoke about the brother who had raised her after their father died, who had sacrificed his own desires to make sure she had everything she needed, who had found love late but completely, and who had built a life and a family that was a testament to what was possible when two people truly committed to each other. "My brother taught me that real love is not about grand gestures or empty promises," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "It is about seeing what someone needs and providing it, about building something solid and lasting, about showing up every day and doing the work." He saw that Penelope needed windows to work by daylight, and he built them for her. But more than that, he saw that she needed a partner who would respect her strength and independence, and he became that for her. They built a life together that honored both of their dreams, and in doing so, they created something beautiful that will outlast them both. As Daniel and Penelope danced together that night, moving slowly to music played by a small band, they reflected on the truth of Mary's words. Their marriage had not always been easy. There had been disagreements about how to balance work and family, about where to live and how to spend their time, about how to raise their children and manage their businesses. But they had faced every challenge with honesty and respect, with a fundamental commitment to each other's happiness and fulfillment. "I would do it all again," Daniel said, holding her close. "Every moment, every challenge, every compromise. It was all worth it to have this life with you." "So would I," Penelope agreed. "You gave me light, Daniel Sawyer, not just through those windows but in every way that matters." They continued to dance as the night wore on, surrounded by the family and community they had helped build, secure in the knowledge that they had created something lasting and true. The seamstress who had once worked by candlelight and the mountain man who had built her windows to work by daylight had found in each other not just love, but partnership, purpose, and a legacy that would endure for generations. Daniel and Penelope lived into their 70s, continuing to work and love and build until their bodies finally demanded rest. They passed away within 6 months of each other, Daniel first in the mountain house he loved, peacefully in his sleep after a day spent fishing with his grandsons, and Penelope in the townhouse, surrounded by her daughters and granddaughters, with sunlight streaming through the windows. Their family gathered for the funerals, which were held in Buffalo, and attended by hundreds of people whose lives the Sawyers had touched. They were buried side by side in the Buffalo Cemetery, under a headstone that Daniel had carved himself years earlier, depicting a window open to the mountains, with an inscription that reads simply, "They built a life together in the light." The businesses they had created continued, passed down to children and grandchildren who carried on their legacy of quality and integrity. The buildings Daniel had designed still stood throughout Wyoming, solid and beautiful, testaments to his skill and vision. The techniques Penelope had taught were still used by seamstresses across the territory, and her shop remained in operation under Patricia's management, still producing beautiful clothes for important occasions. But beyond the tangible legacy of buildings and businesses, Daniel and Penelope left something more important: the example of what was possible when two independent people chose to build a life together without sacrificing who they were. They showed that compromise did not mean surrender, that love could be both passionate and practical, that two strong wills could work in harmony rather than opposition. Years after their deaths, their great-grandchildren would ask about them, and the stories would be told again, about the seamstress who worked by candlelight and the mountain man who built her windows to work by daylight, about two people who found each other when they had stopped looking, and who built something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. The stories spoke of respect and partnership, of practical help given freely, of love that grew from friendship and shared values rather than fleeting passion. And in those stories, passed down through generations, the fundamental truth remained clear. Daniel and Penelope had found what everyone seeks: a love that honored both partners equally, that brought light into darkness, that built something lasting and true. They had taken two solitary lives and woven them together into something stronger and more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. In the end, the windows Daniel built for Penelope became a metaphor for their entire relationship. He had seen her working in darkness and brought her light. She had seen his loneliness and brought him connection. Together, they had opened windows in each other's lives, letting in the light of love and partnership, creating a space where both could flourish and grow. Their story became part of Buffalo's history, told and retold, a reminder that the greatest love stories are not always dramatic or flashy, but are instead built on simple acts of kindness and understanding, on seeing what someone needs and providing it, on building something together that will last long after you are gone. And that sometimes, all it takes to change a life is the willingness to cut a window into a dark wall and let the daylight in.